In 1962, the Beatles were a wreck. They had just gotten back from what could graciously be called a rough set of tour dates in Germany. Their drummer, Pete Best, was not up to snuff, and their lack of cohesion showed as when they were invited to a meeting, the group showed up incomplete, late, and drunk. However, after this meeting, the group would make a change which would completely change the group's fate, starting their ascent to success. And in this video, I'm going to explain what that change was. To understand how things got to that point, let's go back to the beginning. The Beatles were of course formed in Liverpool from the group The Quarrymen. And as they got better in the local tour circuit, they got to a point where they were offered a position to tour in Hamburg. And as is required listening for every single Beatles biography, Hamburg had essentially become like the modern day Sodom and Gomorrah for continental Europe. The city of Hamburg, which had been built up in the rubble of World War II, had built this cottage industry of prostitutes, drug dealers, and gangsters who congregated in the areas of the city that also featured the numerous nightclubs that the Beatles would be playing at during these years. And you kind of get the implication that the Beatles, along with a lot of these other English groups that had been shipped over from Liverpool during this time, kind of were misled on what the actual conditions where they were going to be in while they were in Hamburg, as each one of the places that they played at was incredibly dingy and sketchy, and the actual living conditions that they had to subside in were absolutely horrid, with the horror stories of them having to, warm themselves with a Union Jack because they didn't have any covers. But this also really fit what the Beatles were at that point, a rough and rowdy rock and roll band. You can see that with their look that they had at the time. Unlike the clean-cut mop tops that we think of whenever you think of like generic Beatles today, the Beatles at that point in time were these roughneck, long, greasy-haired ruffians which looked like the type of individuals that would frequent these type of establishments. And while the conditions were definitely rough, even for an up-and-coming band, it could not have been designed to be better for their development as a group. As George Harrison would later mention, Hamburg was like our apprenticeship, because for up to 8 hours a night, the Beatles were expected to play to the crowd goers. And by play, I mean sound needed to emanate from the stage. That was about the requirements that we're talking about here. Because essentially the group was being paid to practice during that time. So they would be playing these cover songs of these old 50 rock and roll standards for like 20 minutes at a time with like 14 guitar solos in it. And in these rough and long hours, the group got by with a little help from their friends. Their friends in this case being Preludin, a off-prescription use stimulant that would keep the group literally foaming at the mouth while they, blared on with Rock Around the Clock. And as you think about it, this likely was the beginnings of their songwriting development that would become the Beatles. Because while obviously Lennon and McCartney had been writing songs before Hamburg, this was the period in which you can see that they're playing these truly classic rock and roll songs and understanding functionally how these songs structurally work. But they're also changing the chord progressions in strange ways to just, keep themselves entertained for these, absurdly long shifts that they're working up on stage. This was also the beginnings of their stage show, as the group would constantly be told by these club owners to put on a show. And so like Lennon would make like monkey sounds and like, dance around. It wasn't that, high class, but I mean, we were getting there. And it was also later during this period that they would adopt the famous Beatle haircuts as part of their relations with Stuart Sutcliffe, who was also one of their friends and musicians at that point in time. However, the group would return to Liverpool as likely the best practiced and probably just the best group to be in the city. And it was at this point the stars would align, as on the 9th of November 1961, a certain music store owner, Brian Epstein, saw the group perform at the Cavern Club and was awestruck. I was immediately struck by their music, their beat, and their sense of humor on stage. And even afterwards, when I met them, I was struck again by their personal charm. And it was there that really it all started. And I think it really shows two things. One, just how much the Beatles had improved from their time in Hamburg, but also just how much of an eye Brian had for like raw talent, because the group was raw. They were eating up on stage, they were cursing up on stage, they were fighting up on stage, they were doing anything besides like actually playing music up on stage. And it's also further impressive because Brian actually asked around to one of their previous managers, who told Brian to not touch the group with a barge pole because they had kind of stiffed him out of some like fees. So they're not looking like the big bag of money that they would eventually become. But despite these warnings, Brian still called for that meeting that I mentioned. If Brian was looking for some, hidden show of professionalism in this meeting, he certainly didn't get it, because whenever he called the meeting, John Lennon, George Harrison, and Pete Best showed up without Paul McCartney because he was, quote, at home taking a bath. But George reassured him, saying he may be late, but he will be very clean. However, Brian did in fact decide to take the Beatles on as their manager. He began to make some changes which would completely alter the history of the Beatles, and by virtue of that, completely change popular culture with this one little trick. Doctors hate this one little trick. That trick, making them look professional. Today, if you entered in like, make Beatles, the like generic AI reproduction of that is going to be these mop top suited and booted guys. However, it's really hard to like overestimate just how far of like a stretch and how novel that was in this rock and roll world, or in at least as much as John Lennon and co understood what rock and roll was. Rock and roll was about wearing jeans, wearing these ratty old t-shirts, and looking like a delinquent because it was music primarily made in some way for delinquents. So to come out and wear a suit and tie, literally like the definition of the man, was unthinkable. Unthinkable. And in this negotiation, you get to see that like Brian both understood the need for this business-wise for the group to move up to this level that they were destined to, but also the psychological need to kind of boil the frog, as it were. As Brian Epstein would later say, I encouraged them at first to get out of leather jackets and jeans, and I wouldn't allow them to appear in jeans after a short period. And then, after that step, I got them to wear sweaters on stage. And then very reluctantly, eventually, suits. And these slow clothing changes also came with the slow behavioral changes of them stopping eating, swearing, and mock fighting up on stage. And you can also see Brian kind of pushing his classical training that he had from the theater onto the Beatles, with them now doing a synchronized bow at the end of their performance. And you can see kind of the personalities of the members reflected in how they thought about these changes, because McCartney was the first to approve it, saying that it kind of reflected his classical training and he understood business-wise what they were going for. Lennon was the last to come around, but he eventually came to some kind of acceptance, with him later saying, I'll wear a balloon if someone will pay me. And the reason why these suits allowed them to get higher paying gigs, which in turn allowed them to move up the ladder of superstardom, is because it gave the group a professional look and also made them very cohesive, as like they would later say, we looked like a four-headed monster with the same haircuts and same outfits. The difference between Elvis being nearly arrested for obscenity and the Beatles being widely accepted in everyone's living rooms is because the suits, like they just kind of made them look, they weren't threatening. Their time in Hamburg gave them the musical chops to become what they would become. But it was these suits that allowed them to climb the ladder of success. I think it also showed just how much Pete Best needed to be cut for Ringo, because now that everyone's in suits, it's like, why does this guy not have the same haircut? I think this is a very inspirational story, as it shows that even the greatest men in the world still had a lot of kinks to work out in those early years. But looks alone are not enough to climb up the mountain of success. You need, in fact, good business decisions, which is why you need to watch this video, which goes over a musician who made very, very, very poor business decisions, so that way you don't have to do the same.